used to helping people and having the ability to help them kind of resolve their issues, so why wouldn't we be able to do that with ourselves? So we just don't talk about it as much.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's easier to have words for burnout and compassion and all this.
Or just to talk about it even with your peers.
Okay. Okay, yeah, we'll get into that a bit. I was gonna do STS, quick a second.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Last one, STS. Thoughts on that?
I kind of think like what Sarah had said about you don't really talk about it, but sometimes I wonder too if it's more so that people don't want to admit that something bothered them to that point, because in our profession you have to be able to have good boundaries, and people can think that if they let something get to them too much, that maybe they're not
Up to the task.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think later on we'll get into some kind of cultural norms and just talking about this will release some of that. So the next slide you guys actually have, I mean, you have all the slides. We're not gonna get into this too much, but, because you are capable of reading. But this is a nice little graphic that teases out the differences between all of them. So the next few slides, we're gonna kind of just go through them a little bit more in depth. So just to start, yeah, burnout is essentially general occupational stress. Let's talk about can you give me some examples? Obviously there's some stuff up here, some examples of some things that lead to burnout.
High caseloads.
Yeah,
Overtime.
for sure.
Intensity within the caseload. So like every caseload.
Yeah,
Every case is pretty high stress.
yeah. You might have a low caseload, but every case you get is the worst case ever. Which is what I experienced in MST. POs would give you these cases, oh, this is the worst one, Ben, this is the worst one. Every time one is the worst one. It's okay, I don't know what that means anymore. Other things?
Little support, whether that's from your peers or from your supervisor, like if there's little oversight with the intense caseload that you're managing, you might feel just overwhelmed with burnout.
Yeah.
I think at work and even in personal life, like
Yeah.
even just the lack of social support, you know, and your friends or family in addition to work.
Great, thank you. We're gonna run through some components of burnout, which I think you've all kind of touched on a little bit. Who here has been emotionally exhausted? Yeah, yeah. What do you think that looks like? I mean, when thinking about your staff and you think about emotional exhaustion, what do you typically see behaviorally? Like, what are they doing? What are they not doing? That kind of a thing. Grumpy.
Less able to problem solve.
What's that? Less able to
Less
problem
able to
solve. Yeah. Yeah.
Disengaged.
Mm-hmm. Disengaged. Yeah.
Picking the easy tasks at work.
What was that?
Picking the easy tasks,
Okay.
like the paperwork that doesn't take a lot of effort.
Okay. Yeah.
Those are advantages.
Some people call that prioritizing, but if you're avoiding the other tasks completely, yes. Yep. Picking the easy tasks for sure.
Or client avoidance if you feel like you can't be helpful to them.
Yeah. Avoidance. We'll definitely be talking about that one.
Disregarding other people's emotions.
Hmm. Maybe they're normally very supportive of others, and then you see a change there. Yeah. What about cynicism and depersonalization? What does that look like to you guys?
The phrase "yes, but." You talk to them, yes, but, and everything but, then it can't be solved.
Hmm.
No?
Lack of empathy, being able to show.
I think of just like a lack of being able to take a different perspective when there's something going on with the client.
Hopelessness. With cases.
Yeah, I think it's easy to, no matter what job you're doing here, there's a lot to be up against, and it's easy to fall into a attitude of hopelessness. This last one, pretty straightforward, feeling ineffective, like we just kind of talked about. I think that's very closely related to feeling hopeless. Just a little comment here. I like this, and it's interesting to me. Mismatch in the workplace between desired state and reality. Burnout lives in the space between our current reality and our desired state. So I think of folks that maybe want something that isn't always realistic, and then when we're burned out, that can get even more. Folks that maybe I'm a therapist and I'm paid $35,000 a year, but I should be paid $70,000 a year. Yeah, probably, but that's not reality, and that can really wear down on folks. That kind of a thing.
We can do all that. So compassion fatigue, I think you guys, right, kind of nailed it. I really like that analogy of pouring from an empty cup, because that's a lot of what it's about. Charles Figley is really the one who sort of coined this phrase, sort of the godfather of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. He really talks about compassion fatigue as a cost of caring, right? That if we're going to do this kind of work and work with kids and families who have just experienced trauma and pain and suffering, compassion fatigue is just something that we should expect. But I felt like I like just kind of these definitions of kind of those two words, right, that sort of make up compassion fatigue. So compassion, a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by suffering or misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the pain or remove its cause. And then fatigue, a weariness or exhaustion from labor, exertion or stress, the temporary loss of power to respond, a state of or attitude of indifference or apathy brought on by overexposure. When we talk about compassion fatigue, we're talking about the cumulative effect of working with traumatized individuals over time. So it's not so much sort of the one time we show up, and we'll talk more about secondary trauma, like a client experience that impacts us sort of immediately. Compassion fatigue is more of just this every case, every family, every situation, there's a lot of pain and suffering, and sort of over time that weighs on us as we have a desire to help alleviate that pain or remove its cause. So that's really, in a nutshell, what compassion fatigue is and sort of looks like.
All right, let's jump into the main event here. STS, this is a couple basic definitions. Emotional stress, from kind of one, hearing about one firsthand traumatic experience from another. I'll let you guys read through this, but I want to highlight a few things. One thing to note is the second one, it's natural, it's normal, it happens to everyone. You're gonna run into secondary traumatic stress. You're gonna experience these symptoms. And on top of that, these symptoms really align with PTSD. Is that new to a lot of you? Not anyone in my division, I would hope. But to me, that's I think when you first get into that can be kind of shocking in some ways. I think, wow, PTSD is this diagnosis that we think of. That's it's a DSM diagnosis, and here we are talking about it as this is something that our staff are going to be running into, and largely unavoidable. But that's okay. That's what we're here to talk about. We're going to move into some stuff, kind of talking about awareness, and some other kind of resilience activities. So, here we go.
All right. So, right, so we kind of walked through each of these terms or these concepts, right? This is just kind of a nice graphic, and again, I mean, that's in your PowerPoint there. I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but I do wanna draw your attention to a couple things, right? So at the top there, it talks about burnout, sort of that cumulative effect. I think we've talked about that over a period of time, just sort of being worn out from dealing with the pressures of the job, maybe not having enough resources to do the type of job that we feel like we want to do. For compassion fatigue, it's also cumulative, right? We just talked about that overexposure over time that really just kind of wears on us. Whereas for secondary trauma, it's more immediate. Maybe I go and meet with a client for the first time, and that client has a trauma history that maybe somehow touches my own personal history, right? And so now I'm maybe triggered by that client or their client's experience, and so I might come away from that one session with that one client with some of these symptoms that we're going to get into a little bit here. Let's see, burnout related to the work environment, right? I think we've kind of talked about that enough already. Compassion fatigue related to empathic relationships with multiple clients. And again, secondary traumatic stress related to empathic relationships with one client or one client's experience. Right? So it gives you a sense of some of the differences there. Burnout, and we're going to talk more towards the end about some things that we can do to help, particularly with STS, but right, when we think about the remedy for some of these things, right, it says remedy for burnout, just has to do with time away, maybe some vacation time, hopefully recharge and come back refreshed and sort of ready to go again. For compassion fatigue and really for STS though, talks about the remedy being more about treatment for the self, right? I mean, certainly if we think of secondary traumatic stress as essentially the same as kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Of course, the treatment there would be, hey, just go take a vacation and you'll come back and feel better. So, right, it's more about what are we doing for ourselves. Not to say that maybe some time away wouldn't be helpful, but that's really not in and of itself. So, all right. So before we talk about some more of the symptoms or the signs, what it looks like, I wanted to share this quote. This comes from Dr. Rachel Remens. She's an author of a book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but she says that the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I love this, and I feel like it really, at least for me, is at the heart of kind of what we're talking about. And we're not going to be able to do this kind of work with the clients that we serve that have gone through some pretty horribly amazing things and not be affected by it. I think Ben kind of spoke to that a little bit too, like this is normal, this is part of the work. And I think in that organizational assessment that Ben shared at the beginning, the staff responded like, hey, we do a really good job of kind of talking about physical safety and kind of knowing where people are and how to take care of ourselves in that physical space. We want to be able to do that well when it comes to our psychological safety and well-being too. So part of the reason that we're here today.
All right, symptoms. In a second, we're going to run through some kind of categories of symptoms. But we thought, in your same groups, you could talk about things that you've seen, maybe some specific behaviors or whatever the case may be that you've noticed, and then we'll come back and share what those are.